So how many of you guys have ever visited any of the Indian mounds around here? Which ones?
Adalah.
Adalah's the closest one. Okmulgee, down in Macon. Anybody been there? Anybody been up to Ohio? Have you seen any of the mounds up there? Ohio has probably the greatest concentration of large monumental earthworks in the country. So what I want to try to do with this is just try to introduce people to a lost world, basically, is what this is about. And we all are aware of the fact that there were some pretty incredible and amazing things going on with ancient civilizations of Egypt and Samaria, and you know, the Incans and the megalithic builders in the British Isles and so on. But it seems what is not appreciated is how vast and how extensive was the civilization that was here prior to the Europeans arriving. And one reason that the culture that was here in North America has not endured is because the materials out of which the infrastructure of this culture was created tended to be more perishable. You know, in Egypt and a lot of the other cultures, they built with stone. Here, the medium was earth and timber. And so earth can erode, timber clearly can decay away. And one of the things, of course, that happened in North America was that it got overrun by another civilization, a European civilization. And early on, the attitude when the first settlers, the first explorers arrived in North America and they started traversing, for example, the Ohio River, the tributaries of the Ohio, when they came across Georgia and discovered the big mounds here and so forth, was that here was evidence of some ancient culture. There were many speculations as to who this culture might have been, whether it was the lost tribes of Israel or Atlanteans or Celts. There was a lot of theories going on about who the people were behind the building of these monumental earthworks. And while that attitude prevailed, most of the pioneers and settlers treated the earthwork structures with a high degree of awe and respect. But as things developed and as the Indian Wars got underway after the Civil War, there was an attitude shift amongst the Europeans and their descendants that had arrived here. There become a lot of racist attitudes towards Indians. One of the things that happened in the 1890s was the Smithsonian Institute started sponsoring surveys, and a lot of the information I'm about to show you has been gleaned from their surveys that were done from around the time of the Civil War up to the end of the 19th century. But one of the things that they concluded in their surveys was that the earthwork structures was solely attributable to the various Indian tribes that lived here. And what happened is the settlers, the town builders and so forth, the railroad builders that had been looking at these monuments as being left over from some unknown lost civilization began to go, well, it's just the Indians that built them, so there's no value to them. And so of the 10,000 or so mounds that were here prior to the arrival of the Europeans, about 95% of them were essentially completely erased in the process of urban development and agricultural development and road building and railroad building and so on. So what we see is just a small portion of what was here at one time. And so a lot of what I'm going to show you are artists and architects' recreations of what some of the structures would have looked like based upon 19th century surveys. I've included as many photographs as possible that have been taken not only in contemporary times but also throughout the 20th century and so forth, to try to, anything I can to try to convey what this phenomena was all about. So let's just get on with it. Can we turn these lights out now? because I have a lot of slides here. So we'd better get started. Okay. This is first I'm going to quote from modern scholastic scholarly perspective on this thing. Only 200 years ago in the woodlands of eastern North America, there were tens of thousands of large earthen mounds, all of which had been built by Native Americans. They were impressive structures. Visitors who saw them were amazed by the size of many, by their number, and the intricacy of their design. Yet, the significance of these earthworks, indeed their very existence, is one of the best kept secrets of American history. So, one of my goals is to try to expose this secret, because it is a secret. And I have a sense that it's one of those things that has the power to undermine prevailing paradigms about our own past. And for that reason, I think that there are dogmas that have grown up that are around this phenomena that are essentially intended to reduce its significance and explain it away, rather than seeing it as part of a larger coherent phenomena that actually extended far beyond North America. Okay, just some of the things that you learn to recognize in looking at this infrastructure. The design elements of North American earthwork architecture were plazas, causeways. A plaza, you'll see replications or photographs of all of this stuff, so it'll be clear what it is. Causeways were typically oftentimes raised banks that had water between them. A plaza was usually an open area. Typically it could be many hundreds of yards square that was then surrounded by structures. Canals and moats were an integral part of the whole system. Truncated pyramids and truncated cones. There were a variety of different kinds of enclosures, such as ringed enclosures, rectilinear enclosures, polygonal, and composite. And finally, there were elevated, graded ways. These were mounds that could be anywhere from 10 to 30 feet tall, and they would stretch sometimes for many, many hundreds of yards, sometimes half a mile or a mile. And you'll be seeing depictions of these. So some of the early accounts, going back to like the 1700s from explorers, gives a sense of how vast this phenomena was. The works of which I speak are found at the mouth of the Big Miami, the mouth of the Muskingum, at Tomb Creek, and one of the branches of the Scioto. Do you recognize any of those from Ohio? Those are all rivers up in Ohio. They're tributaries to the Ohio River. Those which border this river occupy the space of 2 hours' march as one descends towards the Ohio. In Kentucky, along the Tennessee, in the Seminole country, you cannot take a step without seeing some vestiges of these monuments. Now, the early literature from the 17 and 1800s is filled with stuff like this. These explorers coming in and essentially being awestruck by the vast extent of this monumental earthwork. Mounds in such abundance that the traveler is never out of sight of them. What an immense population, he observes, must have occupied these dwellings, which cover so large a portion of the surface of this region. Now, what he's talking about there, none of that exists anymore. It's all essentially been erased. We have them, they were prolific in Illinois, they were prolific in Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. In fact, all the way up the Mississippi into the state of Wisconsin. They were in Indiana. And then, as we shift further west, we find a contemporary culture known as the Ancient Ones, who were building in the Four Corners area. And there are some very interesting parallels between the two cultures that, if we have time, we're going to get into that. Nothing like the great fieldworks, fortifications, and sacred enclosures of Ohio, or such as are found in Adalah in Wisconsin, exists so far as known on or near the shores of Southern Rock River. Now, he's talking about up in Wisconsin here. The oblong and common round mounds, some of them of large size, may be counted by the thousands. Now, the thousands, none of these exist anymore, because where they existed, Usually what they did was they built on the choice floodplains of rivers and at the confluence of rivers. And of course, when the European settlers arrived, those were the best places for building towns and villages and so forth. So most of the towns that were built then essentially erased the evidence of an earlier culture. But I'm going to get here to a map of the U.S. and what I've done here is I've shaded in the principal areas where we find the mounds distributed. This is the Mississippi River. The Ohio Valley is up here. And of course, here's the southeast. That was the locus of the culture out there, centered on the Four Corners area. Now, recent studies have shown that these two cultures were almost certainly in contact with each other because they had a vast trade economy going on between them. So there were evidence, like for example, of Gulf Coast fish, shellfish, and so forth that have been found out in the area and vice versa. I'll get into that a little bit, but it appears that there were a vast trade network going on, dealing in precious metals, copper, ores, various kinds of wood, various kinds of game, all kinds of things going on. And here is Ohio, showing some of the areas that we're going to be talking about. This is Newark, Marietta. These were Portsmouth, Chillicothe, Circleville. Those are just a few of dozens and dozens of locations where the mounds were found. Some of the ones we're going to be looking at here, so I've just tried to show you where they are. This is, of course, West Virginia, Kentucky. The Ohio River comes down this way. Here's Cincinnati. And this shows basically the same region of Ohio, but this is a digital relief map. And this is really some interesting things going on here. You notice these lineations here. Those are moraines left behind by the great ice cap that once covered all of Canada and extended south out of Canada and only disappeared between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. And it's not long after the disappearance of that ice sheet that was essentially about like this that we begin to see the first evidence of mound builders. And this shows here when the ice melted away, there were several concentrated meltwater routes that dumped into and created the modern river system. Here we see all of these valleys here were essentially all carved at the end of the last ice age. They didn't exist there 20,000 years ago. They essentially appeared there with the melting of the ice. After the ice melted back, then we had the Hopewell culture and their predecessors moving in and began occupying the floodplains that had been created by these great meltwater floods that had come off the ice sheets. So the greatest concentration of the earthwork structures are in these glacially sculpted or glacially created valleys. And they're probably is significant in terms of dating some of them, because some of them appear to be much older than conventional chronologies would allow. One of the preeminent work on this was the Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. This was multi-decades of work by two surveyors hired by the Smithsonian. The first Smithsonian annual report was on the earthworks, and a lot of what I draw from is this book right here, which was out of print for a long, long time. Then on the 150-year anniversary in 1997 of the publication of this work, which first came out in June of 1847, the Smithsonian reprinted it. So I may still be available, and if any of you are further interested in doing further research on your own, I would highly recommend getting this book. So let's just get into some of the maps here. This was one of the more famous complexes here. This is at Newark, and this shows a layout of earthworks. We have here a circle. We have an octagonal form here. This is an example of causeways right here, where you have raised mounds. This whole thing is geometric, It's also, as you'll see when we go on here, it's also astronomic. It combines astronomy and geometry and a system of sacred geometry into one. And as you can see, there are squares, there are circles. You can't tell from this really how large this is, but as we proceed through the slides, you'll get a sense of how big these things really are. Now, of this complex here, all of it is gone, except this circle still remains. If you go up to Newark, you can actually go visit. They've turned it into a park. And this is highly eroded, but it still remains. And in fact, the octagon portion of it is now a golf course. And it's probably actually good that a golf course was built there, because that sort of preserved a lot of it from being paved over or bulldozed for urban development and so on. Here in examining the remains, we discover articles which show the extent of their intercourse with other parts of the country. Thus, there are instruments of obsidian, a volcanic substance found only in Mexico, native copper and lead from Lake Superior in the upper Mississippi, marine shells and cetacean teeth from the sea, and numbers of pearls of great beauty. And of course, this is old, and since then they've shown that the trade networks were very well established. And see if we've got stuff from Mexico, the Great Lakes, and from the Gulf region. That shows a fairly well-developed economy. And clearly, a well-developed economy would be a prerequisite for being able to construct these great monumental earthworks, because clearly, as you will see by the vast numbers of them and how large some of them were, the labor pool necessary to construct these things would have been quite phenomenal. And then, of course, you've got to feed them all and house them all, and that means while they're building these things, they can't be engaged in hunting or gathering or agriculture. It means that there has to be other people doing all of that to feed the workers. So let's get in and see what kind of stuff we've got here. This is the Grave Creek Mound, as it's called, in Moundsville. This is in West Virginia, built circa 300 BC. All of these dates are approximate and open to question, because the way they're dated is through excavation, finding organic artifacts and dating them through the radiocarbon technologies. And here's a plate showing the Great Mound at Marietta, Ohio, which is still there, but it's now eroded down to a nub. And here's the Miamisburg Mound, Ohio, originally about 70 feet tall, 877 feet in circumference. Okay, here's another view of the Great Miamisburg Mound. Now you'll notice all of these mounds, they have counterparts in the old world. Here's Silbury Hill from England. Now, as when you go through and you become more and more familiar with this phenomena, if you're also familiar with some of the stuff that ancient builders did in other parts of the world, you can't help but appreciate that there are extraordinary parallels between what they were doing. So here's the Great Temple Mound at Okmulgee. This is one of ours nearby here, an hour and 15-minute drive down to Macon. You can go and spend a very pleasant afternoon at this place. You can actually see this is quite a massive structure with several 100,000 cubic yards of earth in it. This shows the ground plan of that complex. This is the Great Temple Mound here that we just saw in the previous picture. And you see this little low mound right here would be this one. This is what we call a plaza right here. A large, flattened, cleared area, undoubtedly used for ceremonial purposes. Notice here we have a variety of the very typical structures that we often see: the truncated pyramids, truncated cones. This is a cone right here. This is called a passage grave, and you'll see a picture of it here. Here's a longer view of looking across the plaza at the mound. Almost certainly these mounds held timber structures when they were being used. Many of them show evidence of sunken areas that would have been post holes. So, of course, the timber structures are long, long gone, having decayed away. Because some of these things here most of them are a minimum of 1,000 years old. As we'll see here, the oldest ones are approaching 6,000 years in age. And this is a view from the top of the Temple Mound. It gives you a perspective. You can see a person standing up on it there, just to give you a sense of scale. Just one complex would be quite an enormous undertaking in terms of the sheer amount of labor, the hours expended to build the thing. This is the Passage Mound. There was a raised dais inside, surrounded by 2350 seats at various levels, and undoubtedly used for ritual purposes. There's an alignment, a stellar alignment to the axis of this thing, and it mimics similar structures that we find sometimes on a larger scale in the Old World. This is Newgrange. This is also a passage grave with a stellar alignment right here. Same thing that we find at Okmulgee. So here's another example of a parallel between the Old and the New World systems. They both incorporated astronomical alignments. That appeared to be extremely important to these people, was to find these particular points on the horizon where these events would occur. And here's our own Adalah mounds. And notice, now of course it's become very much eroded from what it would have been originally. It was probably originally 4 to 5 feet higher. You can see it's got a sort of a stepped profile. This is very common with a lot of the structures. And here's an aerial view of the mound complex at Adalah. And they have, this right here has a depressed hollow place right in the center that undoubtedly held a sighting pole, and a line drawn, and this one is actually taller than this one, so that as you stand on this mound looking across this one, they are of course lower now than they would have been 500 to 1,000 years ago, but you can actually sight across this, from this mound across this mound, and the flat top creates the horizon. And where the sighting pole was, on the far side of the sighting pole was a notch. I think I have a picture of it here. Let's see. Yes. So when you sight across, here's the flat surface, and this arrow points to the midsummer sunrise would have risen right where Brad is standing there. So this formed the alignment of these two mounds. Now this is very consistent with what we find for ancient sacred architecture all over the planet, is building in these alignments to key astronomical events. So if you go out here one day, if you slip out there next June 21st and manage to get it there at sunrise, sneak in, because I don't know if they'll let you in, go up to the center of this mound, you'll see the sunrise right here over the center of this one. So the Great Mound A, yeah, so it rises over Mound B. Now if you look at this, what you'll see here is the remnant of the canal that surrounded this. And undoubtedly waters were fed into the canal from the Adalah River. And you'll see that all of these mounds, another thing they have in common with each other is the proximity and association with water. They all have an association with water, and I think there's a reason for that. But I think we have this is the view from the top of the Great Mound. The Adalah River flows right through here. And here we are looking at the remnant of the canal that would have been filled with water at the time this thing was in use. And let's see. Okay, now we've gone on to Moundville, Alabama, which is another visit that would be worthwhile. The arrow is showing you the perspective of this photograph here. You see the little pond right there that is in one of the excavation pits from which material was removed to build the mound structures. We're looking across here. We can see the Temple Mound here with a little replica building sitting on top of it. and that would be this mound right here. So this was a fairly large complex. Again, notice the proximity here to the river. This is the Black Warrior River. Like so many of these structures, well, like all of them, they're all associated with water. And you can see, I mean, even the smaller ones are pretty, represent prodigious efforts of work to create. Now, this is a whole complex that we're looking at here. And you'll see, I mean, there must be about 15 or 20 different pyramids involved in this one. So this is looking out from the top of the great Temple Mound. And here is Emerald Mound, Mississippi. Now this is an interesting structure because it's mounds on top of a mound. And we've got 8 mounds, and this forms an east-west alignment laid out to the cardinal directions. And to give you a sense of the scale, you can see there's an SUV here, and this is the top of the first layer right here. The parking lot that we're seeing right here is now right in this area, right here. So this is on top of the Emerald Mound. This is down in Mississippi. And we've got a mound on this end and a mound on this end. And you can see, get a sense of the scale here. So I'm standing at one end of this thing looking at the other end. So you can get, it's almost the length of 2 football fields. So how many hours do you think it would take to gather that much earth together? And here's looking to the west, down towards the other end. Here's standing up on top, looking down, and a person down there. This is almost 70 feet down. So I mean, you got a picture. We're talking about the height of a 7-story building. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Is there evidence that it was built up? I mean, is it possible that it might have been that there might have been earth there that they?
Well, there is evidence that there was a low hill underneath. It seems like there's virgin earth down below, but it was built up and given the flat top. This is Cahokia. This is a very large complex out in southern Illinois. It's got the largest earth pyramid in North America, which would be this one. And here you can see how it's laid out according to a plaza. Again, you see the proximity to the river here. This has a stockade or a palisade around it for what we don't know if that was for defensive purposes or what the purpose of that was. Maybe it was simply to separate secular space from sacred space. That may have been its sole purpose. Here's another view of the Cahokia Mound complex. Now notice the geometry, some of the interesting geometry. Notice the stepped pyramid profile here. And notice here we have the examples of the truncated cones and the truncated pyramids. And one can't help but note the similarity of form between those and the stone structures that built by the Mayans, Teotihuacan down in south of Mexico City. You see the same kind of stepped pyramids, the truncated pyramids. The primary difference is the material out of which they had to work. Here there was a lot of limestone, which they were able to build with. So these structures have been preserved, whereas the structures in North America built out of wood and earth have not been preserved nearly to the extent out of which stone structures. But here you see the same configuration, the truncated pyramids oriented around a plaza, a causeway coming off of the plaza, an astronomical orientation to the causeway. So the similarities between what the Mayans were doing in Mexico, central Mexico, all the way down around up into the Yucatan Peninsula, very much paralleled what the North Americans were doing. And here, this will give you a sense of the scale of the Cahokia Mound. Now, the Cahokia Mound is not at all natural. The Cahokia Mound is totally a built-up structure. And we'll pull back here so you can get a sense of how large it actually is. And when you stand up on top of it, you can see that one of the things that these mounds served as is they would give you a very good vantage from which to view the horizons all the way around. Almost certainly all the evidence points to the fact that as part of whatever went on top of these structures, the rituals and so forth, involved astronomical sightings, astronomical observations. And you can see how when you have a large flat surface, it can create an artificial horizon against which you can measure astronomical movements with great accuracy. Sir Norman Lockyer, the first archaeoastronomer, wrote back in 1906 that to the archaic cultures, the horizon was their telescope. And then we get to Poverty Point. When one comes on foot into the open space at Poverty Point, there's a powerful impulse to seek definition of its huge extent by finding the bounds set by the outer ring and to get some sense of scale from its hulking mound. But if one approaches Poverty Point from the air, after surveying the archaeology of the Louisiana and Mississippi Delta land, it is the innermost ring which rivets attention. Now we're looking here at a large structure which is down in Louisiana. The inner ring is 2,000 feet in diameter, appearing to be a half circle. This is almost exactly the configuration and the size which the aerial archaeologists can find in at least 5 other earthworks created in the Mississippi floodplain, all of which may have been built at about the same time. In other words, not only were the Indians of 4,000 years ago sufficiently organized to build the huge, even, and geometric ring at Poverty Point, but they were also capable of duplicating it across great distances. Now notice the dating. He's actually saying 4,000 years ago. That's actually the most conservative of the dates. It may have been built as long as 4,500 years ago, which is interesting because while this structure, which we see right here, was being built, this was being built at the same time the pyramids were being built on the Giza Plateau, the same time that the great cities were being built in the Indus Valley between India and Pakistan, the same time the 7 great cities of Samaria were being built. Over here in North America, we had a parallel going on with that. Now to give you a sense of the vast scale of this thing, like it says, this inner ring here is over 2,000 feet across. The total volume of material that went into this thing, and one of the questions is whether or not this was ever a complete ringed structure. You can see that it's been eroded away. This is showing how it would have looked 4,000 years ago when the bayou encroached upon it. If this is an aerial view of what's left, you can see now there's forest in this lowland where the bayou once was. The Mississippi River is not far away here. This is in northeastern Louisiana near the town of Monroe. I don't know if any of you've anybody here from Louisiana? You ever been to Monroe?
No, I haven't.
Well, now you have a reason to go to Monroe. Yes, I was going to have you get up here and give a little talk about Monroe. But,
No, that's...
So anyways, notice right here in the center is an obelisk, interestingly enough. The Indian term, when the Europeans arrived, there was an Indian term that got mistranslated or misheard by the colonists. We don't know what the original term was, but the term that has been used by the European settlers was the chunky pole. And it basically was a pole that served the purpose of being like a sundial. And shadows, as the sun moved throughout the course of the seasons, this was like a giant sundial that created a clock. But the total amount of earth that went into all of this entire structure here has been estimated. And it turns out that the volume of stone in the Great Pyramid at Cairo is only about 1/15 of the volume of earth that went into this structure, which is just a phenomenal amount of material that had to be gathered and brought together and placed into this concentric ring formation. And I mean, who knew? Anybody here that even knew that this was down there? No. And now we're just going to go on a little tour of some of the complexes that don't exist anymore except almost as just shadows. Like if you look at this now, Poverty Point, the mounds themselves are now between 6 and 10 feet tall because they've eroded down so severely. Probably when they're in their heyday, when they were being used, they would have been between 20 and 30 feet tall. And again, the dating of this thing places it between 4,000 and 4,500 years ago, which makes this contemporary with the old kingdom of Egypt, with the rise of the Sumerian city-states and so on. And you'll notice as we go through here, you'll see this repetition of motifs, the truncated pyramids, the stepped walkways up to them, the ever-present water that's always there, oftentimes in the form of a canal that brings the water in. In this case, you can see how the water is being brought to almost turn this whole complex into an island. Menard Mounds, this is in Arkansas, and I got to stop doing that. But as you study these, you can begin to see these elegant geometries that they incorporated, laid out on virtually perfect circles, perfect squares, perfect rectangles with very auspicious geometric proportions, as I'll show you some of. Again, notice the water, always there. This is one I would have liked to have seen. They don't know how old this one was. This is a reconstruction. I mean, at this point, we're almost getting into sculpted forms. And again, a tremendous amount of work had to go into this to excavate these ditches up to 35 feet deep. This is an elevated way. You can see that this thing here is about, I think it's about a third of a mile long. Well, let's see. Each of these squares is about 760 feet. So we've got 1,500. Yeah, we've got probably that thing is a kilometer in length. Again, notice the numbers of these things, the proximity to the water. So what were they trying to do? What was the point of all this? Mound Bottom in Kingston Springs, Tennessee. When you study this stuff, what you begin to understand is that there seems to have been a number of waves of building activity. It wasn't a continuous process from 4,000 years ago until now. It was a process that went in cycles, and then it would quiet down for a while, and then there would be another cycle. The last wave of activity occurred between around 1000 AD and 1200 AD, and it was coincident with the building of the Gothic cathedrals in Europe. So while the last wave of this was going on, the Gothic cathedrals were being built in Europe. And there was also simultaneously the last great wave of Mayan structures being built in Mexico, and a tremendous building boom going on in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam and so forth, building temples. And the episode of building lasted about 200 years.